Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Kafbet. There's a study guide. Recommend you use it. It's a very clear, organized sugya today, and the content is not too complicated. So that's good. We're going to start with a braita at the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet. We have this Mishnah with two cases. We're going to just start with the first one and then move quickly to the second case. And even that we're going to move off of pretty quickly because we're actually just going to use the second case, the kelev with the charara, if you remember, with the cake, as a it's kind of used in a different sugya. Okay, we're going to bring up some totally other topic and then say how, and perhaps there's a machloket, perhaps our Mishnah could be used to prove one side over the other. And we're going to do the same thing with three other Tannaitic sources. And that's going to be the bulk of our daf. So we're going to get mostly off topic. Although it's going to be very on topic to Bava Kamma issues. Tanu Rabbanan, 4 lines to the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet. So we have, let's just remember, we have the kelev and the gdi, the dog and the goat, who jump off the roof. On their way down, as they land, they fall on kelim and they break someone's vessels. So we learned that you're responsible, full damages, because that's expected behavior. So now the braita says, and we're going to have a contradiction between two braita. Tanu Rabbanan, kelev agdi shedelgu mimata lemala pturim, milamala lamata chayavim. We're now going to distinguish between which direction. What's typical, what's atypical. As soon as you get into atypical, you're no longer going to be responsible for full damages. Now, it says here pturim, which means you're exempt. Rashi says pturim doesn't really mean exempt. It means you're exempt from full damages, but you still have to pay half damages. So let's see what the braita says. If they jump from down to up, meaning they jump upwards, that's not so typical that a goat will jump all the way up somewhere, or a dog will climb all the way up, and therefore you're exempt. Meaning, Rashi says, you're exempt from full damages, you have to pay half damages, because again, it's mishune, it's atypical. When it's atypical, we say half damages, right? Not half damages of straw road, that's indirect, right? There's atypical, which is keren, just we don't expect your ox to gore, right? So therefore, half damages, unless, of course, you become a shor mu'ad, that's something else. Milamala lamata, if they jump downward, then chayavim. Sugi makes me think of the fact that we have this merpeset up on the second floor of our house, and there's always cats that like jump. Somehow they manage to get up there, and then they jump down as well. So cats aren't discussed here, but they clearly jump up and down, at least the ones here. I don't know. I don't have a dog, so I know lots of people I know do. So you could tell me if your dogs jump up also, if it's typical or atypical. But right now, this braita rules that it's atypical, and it could be, again, the person who ruled might not be familiar with the behavior and might have just made an assumption that might be true, might not be true. Because we'll see in a minute that there's another braita that says they're chayavim. Okay, by the way, Shuli Mishkan's article this week was all about dogs. Very recommended reading. You can print it for Shabbat if you want and read about dogs in those times, different approaches to dogs in the time of the Gemara. Did they like dogs? Did they not like dogs? All sorts of interesting things from a kind of a historical and also from the Gemara's point of view. Adam v'tarnugol shel dilgu. I was sorry I didn't get to this yesterday with Thanksgiving, but a person or a chicken, okay, it's not exactly a turkey, but it's close, shedilgu, that jumped, bei milamala lamata, bei milamata lamala chayavim. Okay, so here we have, okay, so here they say, okay, like a person, it's not that a person generally jumps up or jumps down, but a person is reliable for damages no matter what they do. It doesn't matter whether it's typical or atypical. That's something else we're going to see. And a tarnugol, that's very common, that they would jump up and down, back and forth. Okay, v'hatanya. Now they say, but wait, there's a different braita that says, hakelev v'hagdisha dilgu, bein milamala lamata, bein milamata lamala pturim. But wait, there's another braita that says, now, we're ignoring the Adam and the Tarnugol. That's fine. We don't have a debate about it, so we'll put it aside. In fact, on the chart, I didn't even put it because I wanted to highlight the two things that more is sometimes less. I just highlighted the 2 lines that we wanted, which is, according to the second braita, it doesn't matter up, down, down, up. Okay? Here, they actually say they're always, I said it wrong before, I'm sorry. They're always exempt. Okay? It's atypical. I was confused for a minute. Before I said maybe the other braita is going to say they're chayavim. No, it's the opposite. They don't think it's typical behavior at all for dogs or goats to jump up, down, anything. And therefore, it's only pturim. So now, how do we deal with this contradiction? So again, contradictions could be dealt with two different Tanaitic approaches, but they seem to say, look, if this is reality, what's typical, what's atypical, it seems a little weird. So Tirgama Rav Papa da apich mepa. Kalba bizrika, vegadi bisricha. This Braita that says it doesn't matter which way you're exempt was talking about, now there's two different ways you can jump. Maybe there's many more, but you can either jump kind of all at once, like one big jump, or you can scale the wall, kind of put your arms and then your legs. Now you're a dog, it's not exactly arms and legs, but four legs and hind legs. So then that's the kind of way a dog would do it. A goat would just jump with all of its legs all at once. So now what's this Braita must be talking about? When it says they're ptuim, we have to find that it's atypical. If the first Mishnah says it's very typical, they jump down, maybe not up, but yes, down. Well, it would be where they each flip. The dog did with the way jumped with all its legs, and the goat scaled the wall. So then they say, well, if that's the case, amai pturim. But then they shouldn't be totally exempt. That's just what we call Karen, which is half damages because it's atypical. To which they say yes, just like Rashi explained already on the first side, right on yesterday's stuff, the end we just read, that when it said pturim in the first Braita, it meant you're liable for half damages. Also here, patur mi nezek shalem v'chayavim b'chatzi nezek. Okay, you're liable for half damages, even though you're not liable for full. So when it said patulim, this reminds me, by the way, of Masechet Shabbat. We kept saying patul, and patur meant really patur aval asul. It meant really on a rabbinic level. You're exempt by Torah law. You don't have to bring a sacrifice, but yes, by rabbinic law, it's forbidden. So patur doesn't always mean you're totally exempt. Okay, that was the first part. We're putting that aside. That was a contradiction, up, down. In the end, just to summarize, if dogs and goats jump down, we assume that's typical behavior, assuming they jumped in the typical fashion that they jumped. You're going to be liable for full damages. If the dog jumps up, that's atypical. Likewise, if they jump down in an atypical manner, it's also going to drop it to half damages. Okay, if they jump up in an atypical manner, it's already atypical anyway, it doesn't matter, it's still half damages. HaKelev shenatal. Now we get to this harara case. Okay, again, what happened there? The Kelev takes a cake from someone's property, attached to it is a coal, eats the cake, drops the coal or puts it down or throws it. We have all different possibilities. We're going to talk about a few of them today. We already talked about it before also. Damages property. And then what is the halacha? Pay close attention. That's very clear. We're not going to even discuss that. He ate someone's cake, obviously has to pay full damages. That's shame. On the fire that he created, and now we're going to get into a whole discussion about fire, he's liable for half damages. So now we're going to have to see why half damages and why liable and what's going on and for what is he liable for? Not even clear. So Itmar, we thought it was clear, but we're going to see it's not so clear. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, now we're leaving our sugya for a minute. We're going to talk about a machloket Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish about fire and the nature of why are we responsible when we create a fire, or why are we responsible for damage caused by fire? I should just say it like that. Why are we responsible for damage caused by a fire? Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Isha mishum chitzav. It's like arrows. I shoot an arrow. What happens? Well, the damage happens over there, not where I am. I didn't actually touch the damage. I didn't, punch someone in the face. Okay. I shot an arrow at something. The arrow pierced the object and caused damage. Okay. Now, if that's the case, then what happens? My fire, I lit a fire. The fire spread. Why did it spread? It's like I shot an arrow, right? When I shoot an arrow, I know it's going to hit somewhere and cause damage. When I light a fire, I know it's going to spread and hit somewhere else. So it's directly my doing. Reish Lakish Amar, Isho mishum mamono. What are you talking about? Eish is just like shore and bore. If my shore, I have an ox, my ox damages, or my dog eats something of yours. Okay. I'm liable because I'm responsible to protect my property. Well, fire is something I created that then caused damage. So it's kind of like, digging a pit in the ground, which is now going to cause damage. Same thing with fire. It's because it's my property. I created a fire and that fire caused damage. That's just like my property damaging. So now the Gemara is going to say, first, why didn't each hold like the other? Reish Lakish, my time alone, Rabbi Yochanan. Now, why didn't he think it's because it's like arrows? Because when you shoot an arrow, how does it get to where it gets to? Because of the power you put into it. But when you light a fire, how does it spread? By the wind, right? Fire's not because of the action I did. Now, obviously, sort of, right? I caused an action, it caused something, right? It spread. Without my action, it wouldn't have happened. But the fact is, it's not the same direct damage as an arrow. An arrow gets to where it gets to because of me. Now, you could say the wind does play a role in it. And if you're do archery as a profession, I'm sure you would say that as well. But it's not the same, clearly. Fire spreads. That's different, okay? And the fact that it spreads to there isn't necessarily because I did it. Again, one could argue, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan does think they're the same. Rabbi Yochanan, my time of the Amar Reish Lakish, Amar Lacha, Mamona, Itbe Mamasha, Halepe Mamasha. Mammon, my property, like a boar, a shore, is tangible. Fire is not tangible. So because fire is not tangible, you can't call it your property. It's not really your property, right? So now we're going to start with our proofs. What we're going to do is take 4 Tannaitic sources, starting with our Mishnah, and use them to prove Rabbi Yochanan is right. That Isho Mishum Chitzav. Okay? Your direct actions is causing this fire. And that's why you're liable. And not because it's viewed like your property and then it's like shore and bore. So Tnan, let's take our Mishnah. They don't repeat the case, and I already just said it to you 2 minutes ago, so I'm going to not repeat it either. But remember, at the end, you're liable half damages for the fire. That's what's going to bother us for the gadish, for the pile of hay or straw that you burned. Or whatever kind of pile of, it could be wheat, it could be anything. Right? In this case, it's not your chitzim that did it, but your dog, it's like your dog shot arrows. Your dog took a coal, created a situation of fire, and that's why you're liable. And then, by the way, why chatzi nezek? Because it's shrorot, because the dog puts it down, right? Then it spreads. That's already indirect. And then that would be half damages. Ela, now here, this Eish, now we're going to have, and this is going to be similar to some of the other cases, this fire, lav mamono de baal kelevu. When we say fire is your property, that's when I created my own fire. In this case, the dog took a coal from somebody else. It was the owner of the cake, right? The one who had the cake, had the coal attached to the cake. The dog takes it, steals it, so to speak. And therefore, the damage is done not by the owner of the dog's property. The fire is it doesn't belong to that person. So if you say it's all mishum mamono, you actually shouldn't be liable for the fire because the fire wasn't mine. So Amar Reish Lakish, how's Reish Lakish going to answer this? He's going to explain the case a little differently. The first thing you have to know is the dog threw the coal. Okay, you'll see in a minute why this is relevant. Because we have to get to the gadish being only chatzi nezek, which means it has to be indirect. So shroro, like the stone, like the pebbles. If the dog threw the coal and the coal lands on this pile of hay, so that is irrelevant to us, but obviously he ate the charai, he ate the cake, that's shame. He's now changing the Mishnah a little bit. When it says the gadish, it meant where it landed. Okay, the same way, if the dog kicked up pebbles and the pebbles landed on a vessel and broke it, likewise, if he throws the coal and it lands in a pile and it creates fire right there, that's direct, that's shrorot, that's indirect shrorot. But it's not fire. Okay, when the fire then spreads, al gadish kula patur, the spreading of the fire, according to Reish Lakish, he's not liable for. Why is the owner not liable? Because you're only going to be liable for fire if it's your own fire, and it wasn't his own fire. The owner, right? If it was me, it wasn't my fire. My dog took the coal, threw it. I'm liable for where it falls and the damage it caused right there. That's what it is. But this isn't Mishum Isha. This isn't Eish. This is classic Srorod. My dog caused indirect damages. I have to pay for it. But I don't have to pay for the rest because fire, I'm only responsible when it's my own fire. This wasn't mine. Rabbi Yochanan, how's he going to read this case? Rabbi Yochanan, the anche anuche. Really, you put the coal down. Al charara. Now here he has to say something else. If the dog put it directly on the gadish, then what? The place, let's go back to Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish said the place where it landed was din srorot. That's why it's chasi nezek. That's the Mishnah. But if he put it down and didn't throw it, then what's going to be? Well, the place where it landed was actually direct damages. It's not chasi nezek, it's nezek shalem, and that's exactly what he says. Al chararav al makom gachelet mishalem nezek shalem. Even though the Mishnah only said the charara, you pay full damages, he says, and obviously the place where the dog put the coal down, where it caused the direct damage, that's full damages. Va'al gadish mishalem chatzi nezek. The rest is srorod. Why is it srorod? It's indirect. The dog put the coal right here. It spread to there. That's srorod, according to Rabbi Yochanan, because it was the koach of the dog. It was his actions that caused the fire to, right? Number one, direct actions caused the fire right in that spot and the destruction right there. The spreading of it is like his arrows, but it's like his arrows in a way of srorod. It's only half damages because it spread, that's already indirect. But yes, it's from the dog's actions. It doesn't matter whether it was owned by the dog or not owned by the dog. So now we've managed to explain that case according to both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Second source, and again, all four sources we're going to try to use to say Rabbi Yochanan must be right. But in the end, we're going to explain them also according to Reish Lakish. This is fun because it's the Hanukkah, so again, we're getting to Hanukkah soon, even though the Hanukkah part of this is not really our focus, but it is a Mishnah that relates to Hanukkah. Gamal ta'un pishtan. You might be wondering, how does this connect to Hanukkah? Well, you have a camel that has flax on its back, a big pile of flax. You'll see how big in a minute. Ba'avar b'reshut harabim, walking through the public thoroughfare. Nichnisa pishtano letoch hachanut v'dalko b'nei rosh shel chemvani. Well, what happens? The owner had put so much flax on the camel's back that the flax jutted went into a store. In the store, there was a candle lighting, candle lit, because basically that's what happens when in those days, instead of lights, they had candles. So the flax goes in, catches on fire, and burns a house down. Baal gamal chaya. So obviously the camel owner is responsible for this damage. Right? We're going to see later, in the words of the Gemara, well, what were you doing putting on so much flax on your animal that it could get into someone's store? Right? But if the store owner, maybe you can start to see where this is going if you haven't looked ahead, if the store owner leaves his candle outside, as I'm talking about the Hanukkah connection, this goes back to, right, what the expectation is. Again, we've been talking about this a lot, and we're going to see this. We're almost at the sugya of Adam Muad Olam, a few more days. Now, human responsibility for their actions. I'm fully responsible for my actions no matter what, unless someone else is more responsible, okay? So it's irresponsible to leave your candle outside when you know the camels are walking through. It's a little bit like shame, right? Why were you leaving your food out there knowing the camel was going to, right, walk by and maybe eat it? So don't leave your food outside. Don't leave your candle outside. It's dangerous. However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'ner Chanukah patur. Rabbi Yehuda says when it's Hanukkah, though, it's a whole different story. You're not liable. It's very interesting. Why is that, right? So you could say, well, on Hanukkah, everybody knows there are going to be candles outside, so they should be more careful when they walk their animals through. The Gemara actually says later on, we'll get to this later in Bava Kamma, that the reason is because you're doing a mitzvah. So you're kind of protected by the confines of the mitzvah. So by the way, unfortunately, whenever it's Hanukkah and the news in Israel, you always hear there was this burn, there was that burn. Like there's a lot of dangers actually with Hanukkah between the hot oil and the lakish and the candles. It's not like you're protected, but the point is basically, since you're allowed to put it out there because of a mitzvah, therefore the camel's owner is going to be responsible. Okay, but that's a side point, just interesting because it's interesting in general, and we're getting up to Hanukkah. So if you get into some issue with someone lighting up on fire from your outdoor Hanukkah candles, you can have some excuse. Okay. Bishlama lamanda amal. Let's go back to the beginning. Lamanda amal isho mishum chitzav. Chitzav de gamalhu. Okay. If you say eshes mishum chitzav, what happened? The animal lit on fire, and then not the animal, but the flax on its back. Then the animal continued on, got to a house. The house burned up, and the assumption is what happened. The animal, maybe was right next to a house at the moment, a little bit of fire got onto the house, and then the rest of the house burned on fire. Now, why would the owner be responsible? Again, it's the same thing as before. The owner's responsible because it's the actions of the owner's gamal, right? First of all, the owner was irresponsible by having so much pishtan. Then it lit on fire. Then it caused this fire, right? It caused the whole house to burn down from, the moment the fire touched the house, the rest of the house burned down. That's mishum chitzav. It's like shooting an arrow. That was all your fault. But if you say it was mammon, that it's your fire caused damage, like your shore caused damage. This fire was the owner, it was the chemvani's fire. Okay, and therefore it's not your fire, it's not owned by you. So Amar Reish Lakish, hacha b'mayaskina, b'misachsechet kol habira kula. If you remember in the last one, what did we basically do to avoid the problem? We said it's not fire that catches and spreads. That's only going to be if it's your own fire. But it's a case where it was direct, right? The dog, again, it was indirect, but the dog threw the coal directly onto this gadish. When it hit the gadish, that part of the pile you're responsible for, not the rest of where it spread. So Reish Lakish, in this case, it says you burnt the whole house. How could you possibly say that? Well, it's a case where the camel walked around the whole house and directly burnt every part of the house. A little bit of a stretch, but that's what they say. So now, I say, no, but ihachi, then the rest of this doesn't make sense. If the chemvani left his candle outside, the chemvani is responsible. If the animal then went with the fire on its back and walked to every single part of the house and burnt it, that's not all the chemvani's responsibility. Maybe the first spot, but not after that, right? It's not his fault. The owner should have walked the camel away from the area so it didn't burn the rest of the house. That's direct damage caused by the animal in a way that was avoidable. So they answered b'shamda. It's when the camel stood. Okay, this is a very weird answer. Even the Gemara has no idea what they're talking about. Amda b'sichsecha. If the animal stood and somehow, maybe it was a very small house, and while he stood in one place, somehow burnt directly all the spots, which has to be because that's what we were talking about. Of course, the chemvani is exempt and the Baal Gamal is chayav, because again, if the animal just stood there and with that caused this terrible fire, it would have taken a few minutes and the owner should have led his camel away from it. So that doesn't make any sense. This is where we get into creative answers offered by rabbis of the Gemara. Rav Huna bar Manoch mishmei de Rav Ika. Okay, so Rav Huna bar Manoch says the name of Rav Ika. Rav Ika was the one who was creative here. He says, it's a case where the animal was in the middle of doing its thing. It was urinating, or we don't know what he was doing, but whatever, right? Whatever he was involved in, some sort of releasing his excrement in some way. And then the owner couldn't move the animal. When the animal's doing that, it's impossible to push the animal and say, go, go, go. And therefore, Rashi says it very well, the anushu. The owner had no choice, okay? He was stuck. That's when we can shift the responsibility again. The responsibility was really the store owners because he left his fire outside his store. But what happened? As soon as the responsibility shifts to the owner, because the owner didn't push the camel out of the way, the owner is going to be responsible. But in this case, that didn't happen because the owner wasn't responsible, because there was no weight. The owner was going to be able to get the camel to move. So we end up with a situation where we can explain this Mishnah according to Reish Lakish as well. By the way, I see someone wrote, thank you for pointing that out, that we don't hold like Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to Hanukkah. Okay, so just so you know, if you do that, you're actually not exempt. Okay, turning out I'm a bet we're now going to have a summary of this, like the responsibility here. Reish bal gamal chayav de lo ibayele la'afushe b'ti'ina. The first part where he put so much flax on the animal that it got into the store. The owner of the camel is responsible because the owner should not have put so much flax on the back of the camel to the extent that it would go and jut into stores and cause damage. And in the seifa part, the store owner is responsible because they shouldn't have left their candle outside. Again, we have this, shifting of responsibilities. Who's more responsible? Obviously, they're both somewhat responsible, but one is more responsible than the other. So again, what did we do with both these cases? They first seem to both indicate that there was a fire. There was someone responsible for the fire. We assume it was a fire that spread. If it's a fire that spread and we make the owner responsible when it wasn't the fire that was their own, either it was a coal of someone else or it was the fire of the storekeepers, then how could Reish Lakish make you responsible? It would only be because of chitzad, because of arrows, because I caused something that caused something else, right? That my actions directly caused this fire to spread. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish says, no. You would have to explain those cases as a case where it's not fire because of fire. Fire is really only because when it spreads and my property damage. The responsibility here is specifically if it was direct damage, where the animal went or the dog threw. In the first case, it was just that one spot. In the second case, you couldn't say that because it said he's responsible for the whole house he destroyed. But you'd have to say the animal kind of went to all the areas and spread the fire around. And we said it had to be standing while, right, where the owner had no way to move the animal because the animal was going, removing its waste from its body and it wouldn't budge. Third case, Tashma. Hamadliket Hagadish. Okay, before we even get to this case, I want to teach you a basic principle that we're going to see a bunch of times as well, especially in Masechet Sanhedrin. We'll learn the whole basic law and the background to it when we really deal with the sugya head on. Kim le b'derabba mineh. Kim le b'derabba mineh means, and we probably dealt with this in other cases, I'm sure we did. It means, I think in Ketubah we had it. It means that when you do an action that you're liable the death penalty. Okay, there's other things, but let's just go with the death penalty, which is obviously very harsh. And in the same action, you also were responsible to pay money for damage you caused. We basically say, kimle, establish it with b'derabba mineh, with the more harsh punishment, and we're going to exempt you from the monetary payment. So if in one action, you both are liable the death penalty and payment, you don't have to pay. So let's look at our case. Hamadliket Hagadish. Light a fire. There was a goat that was tied down. Okay, that couldn't move. We're going to see the goat being tied down is not really important because it's just kind of compared to the Eved. The Eved Samuchlo. And there's an Eved Knani, a Canaanite slave, who's right next to where you lit the fire, but not tied down, which means he could move. Okay? Nisraf imo, if the Eved gets burned, and the Gdi and the Gadish. So you have three things that get burned here. Chayav. The owner is responsible. Now, it's interesting. The owner's not really responsible. The owner, the person who made the fire, is not responsible for the Eved, really, because the Eved has two legs and wasn't tied down and could run away. The fact that the Eved didn't run away means that the person who lit the fire is not really responsible. Because again, what's the expectation, right? You lit this fire, you assumed, someone sees a fire, they run away. So you're not liable for the death of this Eved in that case, because the Eved could have run. Since you're not liable for their death, you can be liable for the payment. Because again, as soon as you're liable for his death, you get exempt from the payment. So the Gdi and the Gadish you're going to have to pay for. But if it was the reverse case, Eved kafutlo, and the Eved had nowhere to go, couldn't run away, you basically caused the death of this slave. So now it's exactly what you're asking. That's this case. Okay, if for whatever reason, in this case, they give a case where he was tied down, if he can't run, okay, he was handicapped. If the Eved can't run away, Ugdi samuchlo, and the Gdi could. Now again, the fact that the Gdi was tied down, it's just brought as a foil to the Eved. It's irrelevant whether for the Gdi. Vinis rafimo, because we assume the Gdi doesn't have knowledge like the Eved, even though you would think they do have a sense of danger, but halacha views them as if they don't. and nisrafi mo patur. Okay, but in this case, you're going to be exempt. Now, not because you're not responsible for the fact that you burned the gedi and you burned the field, you did, or the pile of whatever it was, but because the eved was tied down and you caused the death of the slave, the din of kimle b'derabba minei kicks in, and you're now not liable to pay the rest of the damages because you're liable to death penalty. Well, this is only going to work if you say isho mishum chitza. Why? It's very obvious. You'll see in a minute. Bishlam lamanda amal isho mishum chitza, mishum hachi patur. If you say the Reish is because of arrows, meaning it's the cause of the person who created the fire, that when the fire spreads, it's as if the person did it. It's as if they shot an arrow, right? Nowadays, especially we're in the middle of a war, right? You think of shooting a gun, right? You wouldn't say, oh, well, my gun bullet, got over there somehow magically, and even if the wind was a factor, obviously I took it into account, the wind and all that. And right, that's the whole thing. So that obviously, right, it's the same thing. I made a fire and the fire spread. It was obvious it was going to spread and it was obvious it was going to burn him. And that's my responsibility. Mishum hachi patur. And that's why, again, it's ironic. But I'm going to be responsible, but because I'm responsible for the death of the slave, which then exempts me from paying the payments because of this law of kimle. But if you say it's mishum mamono, amai patur. Now, here it's not going to be like the previous, which is I don't own the fire. I do. I made the fire. But now think about it. Fire is like my property causing damage. Let's substitute, instead of my fire killed the slave, my shore killed the slave. Do you remember that law? A shore kills an eved Knani. It says so explicitly in the Torah. We've discussed this. You have to pay a penalty of 30 shkalim. You don't die. You don't get the death penalty for this. So now, ilu katal Torah avda, if you're sure killed Torah avda, if you're sure killed an eved, hachinami de lo b'chayev, what you're going to say is not liable? No, you'll have to pay for the shore, you'll have to pay for the gedin, you'll have to pay for the gadish. So if you say the fire, again, I lit the fire here, it spread to there. That means my property, my fire caused damage. My property, my fire causing damage is just like my shore causing damage, which if it kills an eved, I pay 30 shekels. Kills the gedi, I have to pay the value of the gedi. Destroys your field, I have to pay the value of your field. So why would I be exempt? So Reish Lakish, how's he going to explain this? Amar lecha Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Reish Lakish is going to answer like this. Hacha b'mayis kinam, what's the case? Kishehitzit bigufo shel eved, tekimle b'derabba minei. Again, like we answered before, in order to avoid this problem of your mammon causing damage, Reish Lakish is going to have to explain the damage was done directly. I lit a fire and lit it directly. I took the fire and I put it on the eved. That's the case where I'm going to be exempt. But if it spread after to the eved and I didn't do any direct damage to the eved, then it's fire and then I won't be responsible because my mammon damaging an eved, I'd be responsible. In other words, I wouldn't be exempt from all the other stuff. I'd be liable to pay the damage for the eved, which then would make me liable to pay, would exempt me to pay the damage for the gedi and for the field. Now, the Gemara said, right, and here finally, okay, I said kimle b'derabba minei based on, it's obvious from the continuation that that's what's going on. It's obvious from Rashi that that's what's going on earlier. But here they say, here the Gemara says, right, that's why it would work, because kimle b'derabba minei wouldn't kick in, right, in this case. I'm sorry, if it's tzipa gufo, excuse me 1 second. If I did direct damage to the eved, then I'd be liable for death penalty, and then I'd be exempt from the payment. And that's how Reish Lakish would have to explain this case. To which the Gemara asks a very obvious question, or typical Gemara question, Ihachi ma'ila meimra. Well then, what's this source coming to teach you? That kimle b'derabba minei? We know that from many other places. You don't need to say, here's an application of kimle b'derabba minei. It comes up so many other places. You'd be able to figure this out on your own. There's no reason to have a mission that just teaches you the basic law of kimle b'derabba minei. So it would have to be something not so basic. So they say, lo tzricha bigdi decha ve'eved decha. Now, we didn't talk about this before, but it would have to be that, in other words, probably you assumed when we read this case that I make a fire in your field and in your field, I destroy your field or a part of your field. The fire destroys something of your field. Your Gadish, maybe it's saying here, the goat, which is yours, and the slave, which is yours. But now they're saying it could be in a case, and the chidush is this. If the slave was owned by, let's go back to our people, by Naomi, and the goat was owned by Yael, and Ruth makes a fire in, let's say, Naomi's property, burns her Eved, and burns the goat of Yael, you might say, oh, maybe you'd have to pay for Yael's goat because you're exempt from the death penalty, you're exempt from payment on account of the death penalty, but that's toward Naomi because it was Naomi's Eved that you killed. But maybe you'd have to pay for the goat because even it's one action, but it affected two different owners. So comes to teach you no. Kimle, all has to do with your one action. Doesn't matter who's affected by it. You still are exempt from payment. Okay, fourth source, Tashma. And this is the source we've seen before. Do you remember this? You give a fire or you give a shore or a boar into the responsibility of a cheresh shotev katan. If you remember, we had a distinction. Shore or boar you give to them and they don't watch it, you're responsible because why do you give it to someone who's not responsible to watch? When it came to fire, and this was a little more complicated, you're exempt. So we're going to go over the whole sugya we saw there about what exactly is the case, in which case will you be exempt from and why. So first they bring it to say, so again, patur b'dinei adam, if you give a fire to a child or someone who's not capable, then they're exempt when it comes to courts, like a court can't rule that you're liable. God will, take care of you, okay? You'll have to do a cheshbon with God, but not in the courts of our courts. If you say like Rabbi Yochanan, how does fire work? And that's, again, what are we talking about? We're talking about they put something down and then the fire spreads and causes damage. So if the cheresh shotev katana gave them a fire, they put the whatever it was, they put it down and it creates a fire. And then, it kind of spreads. And we view that as chitzav. Whose chitzav are they? The chitz of, it's like the arrow of the child. I didn't put it down. If it was, I gave it to a child put it down. So that means the child's responsible, but children aren't responsible, but it was their action that caused it, not my action. Okay, then it would make sense to distinguish between shore and bore, where I'm supposed to watch my shore. I gave it to someone to watch who's not responsible. Well, then I'm responsible. But here it's the action that's important, and the action was done by someone who's not liable. No, but if you say that, my mammon damaged, well then, again, what does that mean? Substitute instead of fire, shore. Well, if you substitute shore, what's the law? You're going to be responsible if you give your shore to someone who's not responsible. So if your fire is your property, and because of that, you're liable for damages, as soon as you give the fire to the child, you will be still responsible, just like you would be in the shore case. So let's read it inside. Are you not going to be responsible? We know already you're responsible. We saw that sugya. So they say, oh, and this is very interesting. They say, don't ask that question because forget about now we're making up an answer. But don't you remember when we learned that sugya, there was a whole machloket, none other than Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan on how to read that sugya. And that's going to directly connect with their opinions here. And for this, I made another chart on the page about which cases they disagree about, which cases they agree. It was said about this case. Amar Reish Lakish mishmei dechizkiah. Lo shanu ela kashemasar lo gachela v'liba. Reish Lakish said the only case where you're going to be exempt from this is if you gave them a gachela, which wasn't really going to create a fire. But the child or the cheresh or the shoteh, right, the deaf mute or the one who doesn't have knowledge or understanding of anything, they fanned it and they created a fire out of it. That's when you're not going to be responsible because you yourself gave something that wasn't actually really going to create much damage. They made it much worse. Aval masalo shall have it, but if you gave them a torch type of thing, a flame, actually, then you will be responsible because, again, then it's like shore. You gave them something that could damage. If you gave them something that couldn't really damage and they created something out of it, then it will be a problem. My time, a bari hazeka. Because if you give them a shalhevet, it's clear it's going to damage. It's just like giving them a shore and saying, oh, watch the shore, which of course they don't know how to watch it. So of course you're responsible. Rabbi Yochanan had a different explanation, which fits in with his approach, which is afilu shall have it patur. Because why? Again, what does he say? If I give a child a torch or some sort of candle that's lit, kasaval savta decheresh kagarin. In the end, what caused the fire, according to Rabbi Yochanan? Kocho. It's your action. Whose action is it here that caused the fire? Just because I give you, this doesn't mean you're going to go spreading it. But when he spreads it, that's going to be a problem. Okay? Lo mechayev adamasrle. But when does Rabbi Yochanan think there is a case where you're going to be responsible? And this we didn't see before. Adamasrle gavza siltu shrag. If you give him a lot of twigs and a candle, where as soon as you give it to him, those things are going to all combine and quickly ignite. Okay, whether this is really, there's such a thing, but it's so quickly going to ignite and create a fire that then you're going to be responsible. But if it's, and because then it really is your kocho. Now it's not really, but it's almost as if it's your kocho. But anything short of that, no, you're not going to be responsible. So that fits perfectly with their approaches, kocho mamono. So what we did today, we're going to summarize before we get to the very last line, which is we saw, again, we started with this contradiction about jumping up and down. We figured that one out. Then we brought a machloket, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, Isho Mishum Chitzav, or Isho Mishum Mamono. Is it because of your power that you did, right, like shooting a gun, or is it because your property caused damage? And then we brought these four sources, which didn't really seem to go like Reish Lakish, and each time we had to explain somehow, either that it was only the part, right, really in the end, it was only the part that was his direct doing that it would be, in that case, you'd be responsible when, right, in most of the case, it wasn't his mamon or some sort of issue like that. So we figured out how to explain each source like Reish Lakish. We're now going to end with, if it wasn't enough that the Gemara tried to prove Rabbi Yochanan from four different sources, even though they weren't successful, you could see there was a push to go with Rabbi Yochanan's approach, which kind of makes sense, because if it's mamono, it should have just been included in shor or bor, right? So anyway, now they say, Amarava, Kcha umanita mesea le Rabbi Yochanan. Both a pasuk and a braita support Rabbi Yochanan. What's this? Kra, the pasuk dichtiv ki tetzei esh, tetzei me'atzma. The beginning of the pasuk says when a fire breaks out. That sounds like on its own. But then it says yishalem hamavir et habe'era. But then it says the one who ignited it has to pay, which makes it very clear that even though the pasuk started off as if the fire is created on its own, it then there's a perpetrator. There's someone who caused this. That's the one who lit it on fire. Shma mina isho mishum chitzat. From there, it seems like you're responsible because you're mavir. What does it mean, mavir? You created the fire. So it sounds like you're responsible because your direct actions caused it. And then matnita, we'll just do this, even though I'm also going to start with this in tomorrow's daf. But Tanya patacha katuv b'niskei mamono v'siyem b'niskei gufo lomar lecha isho mishum chitzat. This is the exact same thing. It's just a braita that says exactly what the Gemara said what Rava said a minute ago, which is the braita says the pasuk started with saying your mamo, right? As if it's just an eish, a fire of yours, spread. But it ended with saying mavir, you're responsible. It's your actions that caused it. Lomar lecha isho mishum chitzat. Kind of saying, you got the last word in, right? The one who gets the last word in, that's the mavir. In the end, the pasuk ends with mavir. You're responsible because your actions caused it. Okay, and then it's not because of your property that caused damage, where it's less your actions that caused it, right? It's just you weren't careful enough, and then someone else did something. You're sure went out and gored somebody, but that's different than you actually causing the actions directly, and that's what they're saying here. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. Hoping for good news. Be an interesting weekend. Hopefully, a good one.